In the year 1202, a young Giovanni Bernardone, who we would come to know as St. Francis of Assisi, was captured in a conflict between Assisi and Perugia and held as a prisoner of war for about a year. The conditions for Francis would have been harsh. He was probably held in a dark, cramped, unsanitary cell with inadequate food and water for months on end. The physical and psychological strain he would have suffered is absolutely unfathomable. He was around 21 years old, with ambitions to become a knight, a dream that, of course, suddenly came crashing down. And we learn from sources that he became severely ill during this imprisonment. This horrific experience as a prisoner of war forever changed Francis. Many theorize this brokenness is what made way for his spiritual transformation. And Francis, though often portrayed as a romantic or mystic who was always experiencing the beauty and goodness of God, he likely ventured throughout his life suffering from what we would now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The darkness and brokenness Francis experienced as a prisoner of war accompanied him, most likely, probably until his dying day. And yet, Francis undoubtedly became a wounded healer, to borrow the great phrase from Henry Nouwen's wonderful book. Francis's journey might lead each of us to ask some questions. What is the brokenness that I carry? Is there trauma, perhaps, that my body, heart, and mind holds? How can I continue to move toward healing and wholeness, even while carrying these things that are difficult to understand? And lastly, how can I ultimately use my story to become a wounded healer for others, just like Francis? Today's guest is Dr. Richard Patterson, a clinical psychologist and trauma therapist practicing in El Paso, Texas. Two of the primary groups he has worked with in his career as a therapist are combat veterans and victims of clergy abuse. Dr. Patterson has spent much of his adult life on a quest to find a bridge between psychology and spiritual studies. He has shared that journey through 4 books and numerous articles exploring the intersection between psychology and spirituality. He is a regular contributor to St. Anthony Messenger, who has a new piece in our July-August issue titled Turn to the Beatitudes. I have linked to all of this in the show notes of this episode. Forewarning, we delve into some heavy topics this conversation. Our recommendation is to please find a professional therapist you can trust to work through trauma or anything that may rise up as you listen to this conversation. And due to the heaviness of the material, I have not provided reflection segments this episode and feel that that should be left to a professional. So, without further ado, here is Dr. Richard Patterson. Dr. Richard Patterson, welcome to the Off the Page podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here, and you're a wonderful contributor to St. Anthony Messenger as well. So I know our readers are grateful for the wisdom that you share with us each year and your really wonderful stories that have come out in our magazine. So I'd like to begin. We're going to get into some heavy things today. We're going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about grief, healing. But can you begin by telling listeners a little bit about your background and what made you want to become a clinical psychologist?
Sure. I started out really in grade school. I was planning to go into the seminary. And really up until it was the summer right after I graduated from high school, I changed my mind. And in terms of looking back at that, some of the stuff that's come up and the things that we'll cover, I think were factors in that, but we can come back to that. But anyway, I decided, no, I'm not going to go into the seminary. But I wanted to be helpful in some way, wanted to be of service. So first I thought I would be a social worker. But then, to be honest with you, I mean, my motives weren't all that noble because I found out social workers didn't make a lot of money. And like I say, I wanted to earn a decent living as well. So I thought, well, okay, maybe I should go to medical school. But I realized that that was not a good idea. I really hated school, to be quite honest with you, and had problems in school forever with behavior and so on and so forth. So I thought that's not practical. I lacked the self-discipline to go to medical school. So I thought, okay, let's try psychology. And it kind of proceeded from there. I finished my undergraduate degree, went off to graduate school, almost flunked out of graduate school, but they kept me around. And I think all of that ultimately meant that I was doing what the good Lord wanted me to be doing. It just wasn't the smoothest trajectory for me to get there. So I did that. I did my internship in South Carolina, and then I owed 4 years to the United States Army. And so we went from South Carolina, ended up here in El Paso, where I served for 4 years, and then got out and opened my practice. And here I am quite a few years later. So I think it was what I was intended to do. So
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the army, and interestingly, we're recording this is June 27th, which is National PTSD Awareness Day. Two things show up often in your writing at St. Anthony Messenger, and that is your work with victims of clergy abuse, and then as well as combat veterans. Can you dive into your work with these two demographics? You can start wherever you want.
sure. Well, let's start with the clergy abuse issue because that's been a more complicated kind of journey for me, I think. Officially, I got into treating victims of clergy abuse in the late 1980s, in which at that point, I mean, it was not being talked about. But a young man came to me and he wanted assistance. He was suing the diocese, okay, for them doing what they did. And he had been abused by a priest named Father David Holly. Now that's open information because he became notorious. And in fact, when I saw the movie Spotlight, his name is mentioned in it. And my goodness, that was like a punch in the stomach because I knew one of this man's victims, just incredibly. And so that exposed me to that. That was an eye opener, okay? But in many ways it wasn't. Because I'll just share with you very briefly. Back when I was 16 years old, with this seminary that I told you about, or the religious order I was thinking of joining, I went to visit their seminary. And they had me room with a seminarian who was maybe in his 20s. And during the middle of the night, the guy tried to molest me. Okay. And the reality is, I was a pretty aggressive person back then. So I yelled at him and I cursed at him and he backed off. I think I scared him and he backed off and left me alone. And at the time, I never really thought too much more about it. I don't believe I was traumatized by it, but obviously I've never forgotten it. So when I began dealing with victims of clergy abuse, that rang a bell. Okay, yeah. I wasn't nearly as traumatized as the way some of the people were that I dealt with. Anyway, so I dealt with this young man, read some of the initial reporting that was coming out. And what became apparent was that this Father Holly, he had been up there in the Boston diocese, as is portrayed in the movie. And he got into a lot of trouble there. And apparently what they did was they shipped him down here. Poor town, ignorant people on the border there. What'll they know? Which made me angry. So that also exposed me to the aspect of cover-up, because obviously whoever was on the receiving end here in El Paso knew that this guy was a problem. And they did the same thing with him while he was in El Paso. They moved him around whenever he would do his thing. So anyway, I met this young man, and because of that, the word got out that I was willing to treat victims of clergy abuse. And so over the next several years, I saw a number of people not all males, mostly males, but not all males, who, as children, primarily had been sexually abused by Catholic priests. And that, my status with that, my status with treating those people, my status with demanding that the diocese do something about it, did not turn out well in terms of my relationship with the diocese. For a time, I was labeled as an enemy of the church because I was supporting these people in whatever they needed to do. That's not the case now. I seem to have a decent relationship with the current hierarchy here in El Paso, but for many years it wasn't because of that. And, I have no regrets about doing what I needed to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. What was the hit pause here for a second?
Sure.
What was the time period that you had this client, and then also when you were kind of at odds, not kind of, but certainly at odds with the diocese there because of the work you were doing in clergy abuse and
That
psychology?
that was in the late 80s, and it really went into the 2000s in terms of both my treating victims of clergy abuse and being at odds with the diocese because of that. One of the things that happened was that I was interviewed on television. They called up, and this was in the early 2000s when the stuff in Boston was really getting a lot of publicity. And so this young reporter called me and said, I understand you treat victims of clergy abuse, which made me uneasy because that was all confidential. But she wanted to come and interview me. Well, about 2 years prior to that, I had written an article that came out in America magazine called My Church is Dying, which is what I felt at the time. Okay, I felt my church was in trouble. And so I wrote this article, which generated.
Because you were Catholic throughout your whole life,
Yes,
correct?
sir. Still am.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
still
Yeah.
define
Yep.
myself as Catholic.
Yep.
Different than when I was a kid, for sure. But
Yeah.
in any case, so I wrote this article. So at the end of the interview, she was asking me, and what do you see as the future of this? And I said in the interview, well, I have some fear that my church is dying. And so that created quite an uproar. The following Sunday, we went to Mass, and obviously all the priests had been directed to preach about this television interview thing because the priest was talking. He didn't say anything to me, but he was talking about it, and he said, and we shouldn't feel like the church is dying. At which point my wife leans over and kind of gives me an elbow in the side there because she knew what it was all about. So anyway, that soured my relationship some more with them. But at the moment,
Yeah.
it seems to be good. I know that the current bishop, he's a fan of St. Anthony Messenger because I've shared with him some of the stuff I've written. And so that seems to, but it obviously had an impact on me in terms of my Catholic journey. All of that did.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, because I would imagine that as you are coming alongside these people, mostly men, like you said, who suffered horrific sexual abuse at the hands of clergy, that this would do something to your own heart, your own mind, and then also your own faith in relationship with a church in which you had always belonged. So, can you dive a little bit into that journey
Sure.
for you?
Sure. I mean, it obviously had an impact on me. In many ways, I was a little more bothered by the cover ups because I could understand that some of these people, they were troubled. Maybe they were mentally ill. Some of them clearly were pedophiles. And that's a very intractable kind of mental illness. And so that didn't excuse anything, but at least it made it understandable. But what I had trouble understanding were the cover ups in terms of people being moved around and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
And
and even blacklisting you, correct? I
absolutely,
mean, that
absolutely.
is an attempt at a cover up, and
Yeah,
you're in the middle of it doing healing work that the
right,
church needs to do.
right.
I think a lot of listeners would find that bizarre.
It was disturbing, and at some level, I mean, some of my friends, I thought, yeah, good for you, and speak up and blah blah blah. Oh, okay, I appreciated that, but at a deeper level, it hurt
Sure.
because my Catholicism was and still is important to me. So, obviously, and to be honest with you, Stephen, I've been a questioner all my life. So, I mean, I've had doubts that I've struggled with. Some of my writing has been about that kind of stuff and so on. So, this really fed into that in the sense of, well, maybe I'm in the wrong place. Maybe I should find a different path or whatever. And so, in the late 90s, to be honest with you, I took a sabbatical from the Catholic Church. Stopped going to Mass, stopped going to any kind of sacraments, stopped having any dealings other than with the handful of clients that I had. Took that time. I did a lot of reading. I studied. That was when I read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity for the first time, some of Thomas Merton's writings, Henry Nouwen, who had already had a major impact on my life. So I went back to some of the people that I knew, and Thich Nhat Hanh, other points of view, other religions, and so on. And it was a very, very productive time for me. And what was funny was during that time, my mother-in-law was coming to stay with us for a few months. She was a lovely person. I loved her to death, but she was very, very solid Catholic. She was into the charismatic movement. And so when I was telling my wife, I said, when your mom comes, out of respect for her, I feel like I need to tell her that I'm not going to church right now. So bless her heart, she shows up. And I said to her, Betty, I need to tell you that I'm not going to church right now. I'm taking a break. And she said, oh, I can't imagine my life without Jesus. And I said, well, my problem is not with Jesus. My problem is with the Catholic Church. And she said, oh, okay, bless her heart.
Yep.
So it was a productive time, and it caused me to reflect on, okay, what, if anything, is still meaningful to me with my Catholicism? Okay. And that's when I saw I missed the sacraments, I missed Eucharist, I missed the mystical element about Catholicism. And so I realized it was time for me to go back. Some different kind of thinking, some different things that I emphasized and looked for. And but that was a productive time for me, just to stand back.
Yeah. Were you ever angry or bitter? I just cannot fathom the conversations you were having at that time with your clients, and then reconciling that with this church that is also pushing you out.
Right. It was, well, see, that's why I had to accept that the church itself, the Catholic Church itself, was very flawed,
Mm,
very human, and in my opinion, no different than any other particular type of church. And so, I mean, part of when I went back was that, oh, well, I have to be willing to accept this. I don't particularly like it, but I have to accept that this church is flawed. Okay, and the manner in which they have dealt with the clergy abuse issue is very flawed. But there was still enough there in terms of the essence of my Catholicism that has kept me going.
yeah. Yeah. What did I'd like to get into your work with combat veterans as well.
Absolutely.
However, what did you learn from these men mostly who you were counseling? What struck you about them, and what impact did that have on not only your trajectory in life but also your own heart?
Well, I mean, these people to me were all courageous. They were heroes in my book. A lot of them stopped having anything to do with the Catholic Church, understandably so. One man found some healing through art, did some artwork, and that really helped him heal. He had a substance issue. He managed to overcome that. And I actually heard from him a few months ago, and he's become a counselor. So I
Mm,
think what some of these people did was that they became wounded healers.
yep.
You know, they
The
found,
great phrase from Henry Nouwen. Yeah.
really, that's changed my life, but we can talk about that another time. But you know, these people, they faced it. They didn't give up on God particularly. Some of them just gave up on the Catholic Church, and that was enlightening to me because they all were deeply wounded spiritually, beyond psychological wounds. They were just so sense of betrayal, anger with God, and so on and so forth. And they taught me a lot about what I would call spiritual courage. being able to
Mm.
face that spiritual pain and try to heal from that, much less the psychological part of the trauma.
Yeah, you used a great phrase there from a favorite author of both of ours. It sounds like Henry Nouwen,
Yeah.
wounded healer. What does that mean to you, particularly with your not only your own story, your own journey, but your vocation?
Well, I think I read Henry Nouwen's book, The Wounded Healer, for the first time in the early 80s. Okay. And I thought it was good. And I thought, oh, well, I like that, and so on. And then, in what for me was a God moment, I reread it a couple of years later, and it had a tremendous impact on me. And his book, more than anything, helped me face my own issues with addiction, to be quite honest with you. It was because of that book, because I would ask myself, well, in what ways am I wounded? And there were things from
Mm.
the past and so on, but ultimately I said, you drink too much, you have an issue there, you have an alcohol issue. And it was Henry Nouwen's book that helped me find a place within myself to go get some help.
Mm.
So he's been very significant. In fact, bless his heart, I have a book that he signed for me by himself, because I sent one of my earlier books to him, and bless his heart, he wrote back to me a lovely letter, gave me one of his books
Wow.
that was inscribed, and it's just that, it has meant a lot to me. So he's certainly one of my spiritual mentors. That's a little off track, I know, but so that has been an organizing principle for me with a lot of the work that I've done, both personally and then in terms of the people that I deal with. Facing your wounds,
Absolutely.
try to grow from them, try to learn something from them, and then if you can be of service to other people, even better. So
Yeah, and then what about this other primary demographic? I hate that term. It sounds so
I'm
dry.
with you.
But that
The
when it comes to
soldiers,
combat veterans and your
sure,
work with them, dive into your work with this group and
sure,
then how their impact on your own life as well.
sure. Well, first of all, I did not like being a soldier. I wasn't a very good soldier. I had an attitude at that time. I was a child of the 60s and had done some of the marches and so on, but here I was in the military. Didn't have a real good attitude about it. Was real glad when I got out, put in my 4 years and got out. And so flash forward, I start receiving referrals I had dealt with veterans all along, but I really began doing evaluations and heavy duty treatment. And it was kind of one of God's little jokes, because I would have my discharge hanging on my wall along with my degrees and all that other good stuff. And it turned out this mattered to these folks that would come in.
Mm.
That I was a veteran. I mean, there was one young guy that came in, sweet young man, and he was really struggling to talk about what he had been through in Iraq. And he looked up and he said, "Oh, Doc, you're a veteran." And as always, I said, "Yes, I am, but I'm not a combat veteran." And he just looked at me and says, "You don't know what a relief it is to be talking to another veteran." And he burst into tears because it was such a relief for him. I don't fully understand that, but the irony is, as much as I disliked being a soldier, it's turned out to be very meaningful for a lot of the folks that come to see me that
Yeah.
I'm a veteran. I like one man, one of the nicest moments, I was dealing with a fellow who was a Vietnam veteran, and we had finished our interview. I was doing an evaluation, and we had finished our interview, and we stood up, and he looked up and he saw my discharge. He said, "Oh, Doc, you're a veteran." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "But I'm not a combat veteran." And he says, "Doesn't matter. You're a brother." And he comes over and gives me a big bear hug.
What for listeners, what would you like them to understand about these two groups of people?
Well, I would want them to understand that they feel like they don't fit in, for one thing. Both groups. I mean, the first group, the clergy abuse people, they have a lot of trouble finding any kind of spiritual home, and of course they carry a lot of shame, and blame. I mean, a lot of them, even though they were kids, they blame themselves and so on. And really the same thing with the veterans. Okay, a lot of veterans that I've dealt with, they carry blame, they carry shame. They will tell me stories about changing an assignment with another soldier and then having that soldier get killed in their place and so on. And it's not that they want special treatment. It's kind of like one time, one veteran told me, some of us don't like being told thank you for your service because it kind of puts us over here, makes us like separate. You did that. That was your service. And we're over here and we're fine. So I don't do that as much. And so really both groups, they just feel like they don't belong. Obviously the first group, the clergy abuse group, they have a lot of trouble finding any kind of spiritual home. The second group, the veterans, just have trouble fitting in. They come back from horrific kind of events, and even within their own families, they'll feel different, and so they feel like they don't fit in. And so to feel some acceptance, to feel some some loving attention makes a great deal of difference to these folks. And the one thing that neither group wants is pity, which I think is why some of them react to this thank you for your service thing. Some of them interpret that as pity, and they don't want that.
Yeah.
And really, the one common theme with trauma victims in general is that they do and they don't want to tell their story. They don't want to tell it because they fear judgment. They do want to tell it just to get it out, to put it out and try to be done with it. And so it makes a great deal of difference for both groups to feel like they're dealing with somebody, whether it's a therapist or not, who doesn't judge them, and more than anything is willing to just listen and not tell them what they need to do to fix it all. So
Yeah. I imagine that some listeners are hearing what you're saying and maybe thinking to themselves, well, maybe I didn't suffer from clergy abuse, or maybe I was never a veteran, or however the language you're speaking, the words you're using to name this chasm that we can call it trauma,
right.
may be really resonating with some. So can we
Totally.
just go to kind of ground level here? As a clinical psychologist, what is trauma? And perhaps what is a pathway? And I know that, and we should say here at the start that the best thing is to find a therapist or counselor who you trust, correct?
Right.
However, I know, at least for me, it was books, like you mentioned, The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen, or it was
Right.
podcasts. It was this media that I was consuming that allowed me to feel less alone
Right.
during these different aspects of my journey. So, that being said, what is trauma?
Well, when we talk about trauma, you need to keep two things in mind, because there's the official diagnostic definition of trauma, which really has to do with exposure to death or near death or life-threatening kinds of situations, to include sexual assault and so on. That's kind of the official definition. But then there's, in the course of human events, there are other things that have a traumatic impact: loss of a job, death of a parent, divorce, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of other things that have a traumatic impact that maybe don't qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but nonetheless have a devastating impact on us. And it's far more common than we realize. It's far more common, in part because, we all have a tendency to kind of minimize things, say, well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. Yeah, I almost got killed in a car accident, but it wasn't that bad. Or, yeah, my father would beat me up when I was a kid, but it wasn't that bad. And And so, we have a tendency to kind of minimize things, even though they're working on us, even though they're showing up in irritability or withdrawal or even nightmares and so on and so forth. So it's just important to keep in mind, because sometimes people will think, well, my father never tried to kill me. Yeah, he beat me, but he never tried to kill me. I never felt like he was trying to kill me. Yeah, but it still was a trauma. It might not be this official diagnostic trauma, but it had that impact on you. So any kind of life-changing event has the potential to have a traumatic impact.
Yeah, it's a rupture. It sounds like
Right,
it is a rupture in your life in a way that
right,
drastically changes everything on some
right.
level.
And a lot of people will do their best to, I mean, I do believe I've met some really resilient people who've been through some awful things and just managed to keep going forward. And I've seen that a lot in my work. That's part of what kept me going. And and so that's very, very common. But with a lot of people, like in my work, it may not be the reason that they came to somebody like me. But if we just dig around a little bit, sure enough, for a lot of us, there's trauma in our background. And yeah, indeed, there's no correct way to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what you said earlier about this kind of architecture that has played out in your own life of becoming a wounded healer, where for you it began with really confronting, hey, I have an addiction and I need to deal with that. And then even just these different elements of your story, the fact that you were in the army for 4 years, the fact that you did have a clergy member in seminary try to molest you. I mean, all of these different aspects of your story, it's very interesting that now you're using them to be a wounded healer for
Sure,
others. So I
sure.
really like that trajectory, Dr. Patterson, of hey, what does it look like for each of us to become wounded healers on some level,
Right,
even if we're not a clinical psychologist? you know,
right,
how,
exactly.
but for me, my thinking is that much of that begins with confronting. It could be trauma, it can be addiction, it can be that thing in your life that needs to be acknowledged and named and to move through. So what does it look like to move through trauma or these different aspects of brokenness that we're naming?
Well, I think one of the things that when people are trying to heal from trauma, one of the things that is hard for them to accept is you're not going to forget this stuff. I've had people come in and ask me, can you help me forget what happened in my childhood or what happened in Iraq or Afghanistan or what happened with that priest or whatever? I've had people ask me that, and the answer is no. No, how could you? How could we forget those kind of events? And so the process of healing, whether it's with therapy or anything else, really involves reclaiming power from an event that has happened. And of course, one of the strong ways that we can reclaim power is learning to, how can I take this and be of assistance to somebody else? The wounded healer image, it's the cornerstone of 12-step programs. Okay. It's the cornerstone of that. We see that with veteran support groups. I mean, veterans who are frustrated with the VA and so on, they're turning to help one another out. And again, it's that image of wounded healer. Even in the whole clergy abuse issue, the SNAP group that was developed up in Boston as a support group for victims of clergy abuse. Again, it's saying, okay, let me take what has happened to me, but let me get some of the power back so that I can talk about it, and then I can be of service to other people.
Yeah, that's what is so complex to me and nuanced about this is that on one level, a trauma always goes with you, which sounds very daunting. It's in a sense almost working through it throughout the rest of your life.
Right.
And then on another level, in the midst of that, you have to reclaim your power hundreds, thousands of times probably
Right.
as this trauma is going with you. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Yes,
I'm not
absolutely.
saying those two things are at odds, but
Well,
it's
it has
certainly
to do with,
complex. Yeah.
well, and it has to do with not letting trauma define who I am.
Hmm.
Okay. The fact that these things happened to me, the fact that I saw and did some things in combat, the fact that this priest molested me, the fact that I was sexually abused as a child, um, that doesn't have to define who I am. Okay. Unless I let it. Um, I'm damaged goods. I've had people say that to me. I'm damaged goods, you know? And so that's part of what has to heal is that I'm not letting yes, this is an important part of my life, but I'm not going to let it define who I am. I'm more than that. And that's possible. It's not an easy road by any means. But I've seen plenty of people do that.
What defines who you are?
What defines who I am? Um, well, I think my story and sharing pieces of my story over the years. I don't think any of us can sum it up. Well, this is who I am, but um, like pieces of my story that I've shared with you, that gives you some insight into who I am, uh, rather than just labeling it. Um, and that's why it's so important for people to have some kind of opportunity to tell their story, whether it involves trauma or not, because it just helps them understand who they are a little bit better, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know for me, one of the things I at least try to come back to whenever I'm wrestling through, you I tend to have these dark spells every like 4 or 5 weeks, and
Uh-huh.
maybe that's stuff from the past. Maybe that's, just my brain chemistry. I have no idea. But one of the things I'm always trying to remember, whether it's guilt, whether it's shame, whether it's regret, whether it's future tripping, whatever it may be. When I slip into these dark states, it goes back to Henry Nouwen for me. Is
Right.
you're the beloved,
Right.
and because you're the beloved, your story is worth naming on a personal level, and then maybe sharing to help and to heal
Absolutely.
others.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it, like when I lost my mom really suddenly a few years ago, remembering that I was the beloved, it did not solve anything. It it did not explain how a perfectly healthy person can just her heart can stop in the middle of the night. However, it reminded me of a God that enters more deeply into my suffering without the need to explain it
Right.
because we are the beloved.
Right.
Do you have anything to add there? I think it's an interesting conversation we're having about identity and defining who you are, but then also the complexity of these traumatic things that mark us throughout the
Sure.
rest of our lives.
Well, I mean, what comes to mind with what you're saying is that obviously how I deal with trauma is going to touch on my beliefs about God. Okay. I mean, a lot of the people that I've dealt with are very angry with God. Um, and obviously, there was people I've dealt with who, like one man I dealt with, he said, how can I believe in a God when I saw my best buddy burn up in a vehicle? How can I believe in God that would permit that? Okay. Which is for many people that have suffered not just trauma, but like the death of a loved one suddenly, unexpectedly. It pulls us into what is God part of this in any way, and if so, how so? Okay. Um, I, you know, I'll share this story with you, and maybe this is off track, but that's all right. That's your problem to figure it out.
The joy of this podcast is the freedom to go off track.
Okay. Well, this just illustrates the spiritual challenge of all of this to me. The other thing that I did in the late 80s and into the 2000s was I treated AIDS patients, which was extraordinary, an extraordinary experience. And one time this boy was brought in, he was 12 years old, okay, and he had AIDS. This was before they really made progress with the medication and so on. And so he had AIDS, and he was very anxious, which I thought was pretty understandable. So I talked with him and his mother for a little while, and then I asked his mom to step out so that I could talk to the boy alone for a bit. And I said to the boy, and he knew a lot about his illness. He had read about it, and I said, I'm really impressed. You've educated yourself quite a bit. I said, do you have any questions that I could answer for you? And this boy lived in a faith-based family. Okay, so I said, do you have any questions? He said, yeah, I have a question. And I said, fire away. He said, why did God do this to me? Why did God do this to me? He said, I didn't do drugs. I haven't had sex. Why did God do this to me? Okay. And that to me was a stunning question. And I didn't have a simple answer for him. And I tended, ever since then, I've tended to be suspicious when people have simple answers. I dealt with a veteran recently, and he was in Walter Reed Hospital after multiple explosions. And we got into some of these spiritual issues of the trauma. And he said, Doc, I had somebody come to me. I don't know whether they were a chaplain or not, but they came to me a while ago and they told me, well, this has happened to you in Iraq for a reason. God wants you to learn something. Well, he got furious. He cussed the person out and kicked him out of his room. Okay. And so, that's a question that I've struggled with personally, having grown up in a family that lost children. And I think anybody who has been through trauma struggles with. So that, it kind of challenges us, especially if we do have a spiritual foundation of, well, what do we think about that? Why, it's the why, the big why question. And I think anybody who's gone through any kind of trauma that is open to a spiritual foundation is going to encounter that question, why? Why has this happened to me? Or why did this happen to, why did my mother get cancer? And so on and so forth. Why did my sisters die? And I at least don't have an easy answer to that question.
How do you respond when someone asks that question and wants to go the spiritual route with you?
Well, what was helpful to me, quite frankly, was Harold Kushner's books, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And of course, in that book, his position, which is not necessarily, it is what it is, but his position is maybe God doesn't do everything that happens to us. Maybe some bad things just happen. Okay? And maybe what matters is knowing that God may not have made this happen to you, but God is walking with you. Okay? God is walking with you through this. God is with you in your pain, which is what I told that boy. And he didn't question it, and he didn't get mad. I'd like to tell you it had a dramatic impact, but I don't know, because that boy died maybe 2 months later.
Lord have mercy.
But obviously
man.
his question stayed with me, and he's not the only one, but just such an innocent child asking that question. And yeah, I mean, it's come up many, many times. I think anybody that does any kind of counseling or ministry or whatever is going to run into that. Why? Why has this happened?
Yeah, I like what you said, how you're skeptical of people who claim to have answers. And that really resonates. I mean, trauma for me, it's very interesting. And I don't know if this makes sense, but it's one of the closest things I've found to what mysticism means. And what I mean by that, what I mean by that is love as well, trauma and love. But both of those things, complete opposites in some regard. But what I mean by that is, and I think someone like St. John of the Cross hits on this with the dark night of the soul, but it's as if you're trying to find language for this part of your story. And just like mysticism, just like describing the divine, it's like you're always falling short
Yeah.
of fully understanding it, fully wrapping your heart or mind around it. Um, and yet, as you do that, by daring to name it, you're also kind of moving through it. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yes, absolutely. Well, this might sound odd to you, but one of the things that um, not just the trauma of that I deal with, but the trauma I've been through myself. Um, the irony is, did any of that make me angry at God? You bet. You bet. But the irony is that sometimes those moments when I'm shouting at God, when I'm shaking my fist at God, some of those moments I have felt very close to God. Isn't that ironic? But it's made it real. This is an important part of my life, and rather than just saying, "Oh well," um, you know, I'm going to fight back, and I've told people that in terms of the God of my understanding, I need a God that I can argue with, and I know some people have had a big problem with that, but that's okay. It's what works for me. It's defensible. I just finished reading the book of Job again. I love that book. Um, I was reading some of the Psalms. Some of the Psalms are very angry, and so to me, it's all there. It's in the book. It's just being okay with that. And
Yeah. Yeah. I remember reading, I'm sure you've heard of this book, but it was called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, I think.
sure,
I think that's what it was
sure,
called. And a therapist at an evangelical church gave it to me. And I found it so freeing to realize how emotional Jesus was and how
right,
human Jesus was. This
right,
person who really leaned in to every emotion,
right.
even the darker ones, these things that we may
Absolutely.
consider dark. Flipping over the tables in the temple,
Yeah,
or
I love that
that
story. It's one of
moment
my
in the
favorite
Garden of
stories. Yeah,
Gethsemane. Yeah, yeah. I found that I think as men sometimes we tend to downplay or suppress um, feelings of sadness, feelings of darkness, and we just kind of push it down. And I just found that very freeing, that
absolutely.
this Jesus I follow felt it all
Right,
emotionally.
right. Well, some years ago, I also read a book by an author named Pierre Wolf, and it had the provocative title of "May I Hate God." Okay, and it was a lovely, lovely book, and he made the point in there about, well, we define God as a loving father, and what loving father, if his child were mad at him, wouldn't want to hear about it? They might not agree with it, might not agree with the assessment, but tell me, you're obviously angry. Come on, let's get it. Let's hear it. And that was very helpful to me.
Yeah, yeah, we've hit on it some already, but I am curious, for those listening who have a Christian background or who want to use tools from the Christian tradition to help them find healing, to help them move through the trauma that they've suffered, what in the Christian tradition or the Franciscan tradition for that matter can help us on that journey toward becoming wounded healers?
Well, I think that prayer helps in whatever way the person is comfortable. I won't necessarily tell somebody this is how you need to pray, because they need to find their own way there. With all the various trauma victims that I've dealt with, some of them have tremendous faith, and so not to be willing to turn to that as a resource, even if it involves doubts and anger and so on and so forth. And then I think the other thing that our Christian tradition offers to us, well, two things really. One is forgiveness. We have a strong tradition of forgiveness, and Jesus emphasized that. Jesus lived that. And that's forgiving others and forgiving ourselves, which in many ways is even more difficult. But I think our Christian tradition, our Catholic tradition can help with that. Just knowing that it's there, that's one of the things that we're called to. And then that we're called to learn how to love ourselves. And all this judgment about, I'm stupid, that was a stupid thing for me to do, and so on, that's not loving. I mean, I've dealt with people that have said those kind of things to themselves. I remember one time, actually, I was dealing with a person who was a priest, and he was having some trouble with sexual issues, okay? And I thought, okay, and he was just judging himself up and down and left and right, and I'm terrible and I'm a hypocrite. I said, well, tell me this, Father, when somebody comes to you, young teenage boy comes to you, or a married man or whatever, and confesses to that same sin, is this what you say to him? Well, you're disgusting, shame on you. And he went, oh, heavens, I would never say anything like that. I thought, well, then what's the deal? So I think, that whole emphasis on facing our sins, if you will, or our failings or whatever, and learning to forgive ourselves the way we would forgive somebody else, I think is something that our Christian tradition is very, very strong on, as well as learning to love ourselves.
Yeah, I remember a great quote from Life of the Beloved by Henry Nouwen. He says something along the lines of, self-rejection is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life because it contradicts the reality that you are the
Right,
beloved.
right,
Why,
right.
is a clinical psychologist, like, why are we as humans, not everyone, but generally most people I meet are very, very hard on themselves.
Right, right.
And it's so easy for self-rejection to creep up. Why are we like that as humans?
Well, some people would say, without getting into Freudian kind of stuff, some people would say, well, it has its roots in our childhood, which is true. The psychologist Carl Rogers talked about conditions of worth. And what he meant by that was that in the normal course of raising a child, we'll say, don't do that. That's a dumb thing to do. Don't do that. Well, then we'll translate that in our little head to I'm dumb.
Mm,
Being loved by somebody feels conditional. Well, my parents only love me when I'm behaving myself. That may not be objectively true, but that's how the child kind of processes it. So, we move forward with that, with these, what Rogers called conditions of worth, and it turns into some judgment of self. And you're right. I mean, in many ways, that's one of the hardest things to help people break through is just that self-judgment. But what strikes me and what I will ask people is, would you say that to somebody else? Invariably, it's not. It's stuff that we would never say. If I think to myself, yeah, you're stupid, you're weak, what's the matter with you? You're worthless, who are you kidding? So they say, well, Patterson, do you say that to other people? No.
yeah. Do you say that to your children? Do you say
Yeah,
that to
I
your
never
best
would say
friend?
that to them. Good
Do you say
grief.
that to your spouse? Yeah.
No, I never would. But
Yeah.
somehow or other. And so sometimes it's a question of just, and it's so insidious. Sometimes we don't even know it's there until we pay
Mm,
attention to it a little bit. It's like I used to say to people, you have a little Adolf Hitler on your shoulder there, and he's whispering these nasty things into your head, but you don't challenge them.
yeah.
And that's the other thing that comes up. Sometimes I will say to people, suppose somebody walked up to you and said, you're really stupid, and called you a stupid expletive. How would you react to that? Well, I get mad. I'd say, no, I'm not. I said, well, how about this thing on your shoulder? How come you never fight back with that? Okay.
Wow. That's so true. That's so true.
So sometimes we just have to become aware of it and then challenge it a little bit, which is one of I know this isn't what we're focused on, but it's also one of the areas where journal writing can help. We'll write down these negative things and challenge them. Okay, well, I believe I'm stupid. Well, is there any evidence to support that? Well, I've done some stupid things, but I have an advanced degree and have written some stuff and so on. So I'm obviously not completely stupid, and just challenging the thought.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that's, I think this is these are very helpful, practical tools for
Good,
me, and then I hope for people listening as
good. I hope
well.
so.
We mentioned the Christian tradition. Saint Francis of Assisi himself, and maybe you wrote about it actually, but I've heard several theorize that he probably had
He
PTSD.
he has to
So
have. Yeah, he has to
yeah,
have.
can you go a little bit
Sure.
into that and how a reading of his life, perhaps, and again, we're not being prescriptive here. We're not saying
No,
like
no. It's just it's
this is exactly what you have to do to heal. However, I
right.
wonder if there are some things from his life, going back to his own PTSD, that we
Sure.
can glean to take with us on our own journeys toward healing.
Well, I mean, to me, in reading his story, there's no doubt but that he had to have had PTSD. He was a combat veteran. He was a prisoner of war. Um, and it's clear in terms of what we pieced together that when he came back, when he was released from his prisoner of war status, and he came back to his village, he was not the same person. Um, he apparently was described as someone who just was very joyful and outgoing, maybe too much initially, loved to be out in the woods, loved to be out in the fields, and all that changed when he came back. And in fact, he was going back to battle. He was going back to his life as a soldier when he had what 12 steppers would call a spiritual awakening. Okay. And I think obviously at some level he was open to that. As wounded as he was, there was some part of him, maybe it was just a tiny part, that in essence was saying, heal me, Lord, help me. And so when he was going back to battle the second time, he had a spiritual awakening, which changed his life completely, changed the direction of his life completely. And I think, I mean, that's one lesson to take from his story is that even in the midst of anger, in the midst of the storm, in the midst of darkness, if there's a part of us that can at least be open to a spiritual awakening, it can make a tremendous difference.
Yeah, yeah. I had never thought until recently about the probable reality that Francis had PTSD from being a prisoner of war and then being in combat as well. And it's very it's very moving to me that this was a person who, despite what he had gone through, despite what he would go through with his family and then his own body, the fact that he wrote the Canticle of the Creatures, like when his
Right.
body was just tormented with
Right.
illness, I mean, in Francis, I sensed someone who just never gave up on beauty.
Right.
That, okay, this doesn't make sense. I don't know why this happened. However, like you said, I look outside and nature's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain why you go through the things you go through. But for me at least, it has done something to the mind and to the heart to just, you
Absolutely.
know what, this is a crappy day, but I'm going to give beauty a chance. I'm going to give
Absolutely.
hope a chance. And not
Absolutely.
only give it a chance, but I'm going to try to open my senses and take it in and remind me of what's already true. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, to me nowadays, I mean, I've learned that in many ways, the places that I find God are not necessarily in churches. Um, I mean, some of the most spiritual moments that I've had in my life have been when I was in nature. And one time, my wife and I were down, and there's the littlest known national park in the world is Big Bend National Park down on the southern border of Texas. It's an absolutely beautiful place. And my wife and I had hiked back into this canyon, which was absolutely wonderful. And and what was really, it might sound nutty, but it was just a beautiful moment for us. We were standing in the midst of this canyon, and my wife said, "I feel like singing." And so we stood there and we sang Amazing Grace, standing in this canyon. And as we looked at, she said, "Look," and she looked up above, and there were all these hawks just circling. like they were
Mm.
listening to us, And to me, it was a profoundly spiritual moment, not just connection with my wife, but a connection with that place, with the birds, with God. And that's an experience that I've had in a lot of different non-church settings. And I'm real grateful for that. I'm real grateful for that because those have been some of the touchstones for me when I have questions, when I have doubts. Those plus my own healing have been my touchstones because I know that to be all God-centered. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's a beautiful story. I do want to be respectful of your time, Dr.
oh, I'm
Patterson. I
I'm
wanted
good.
to, okay, yeah,
I'm
I
good.
wanted to ask you about a recent piece that you had in the St. Anthony Messenger.
Right,
And this beautiful piece, and it's based around the Beatitudes. And in the context of this conversation, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how the Beatitudes may assist us in healing, in mourning, in
right,
grieving, in becoming wounded healers, as we keep coming back to.
right. Well, I think that in terms of trauma in particular, I mean, there's blessed are they who mourn because I think mourning and grief is an integral part of recovery from trauma. It's been said, and I agree with it, that a person doesn't go through combat without grieving because they have lost somebody, they've lost somebody that they've known. The people that I dealt with, the clergy abuse people, they grieved the loss of their faith as they had it. Okay, because that was part of what some of these people played on to get them to do these things. And there are all kinds of other situations. Things happen. It's the nature of life, and we have to grieve. We have to face that grief. But the thing about grieving that I would want your listeners to know, especially, is that there's no correct way to do it. A lot of people, I mean, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a wonderful person and she helped a lot of people, but she herself never said, I didn't mean those 5 stages of grief to be taken as a literal thing. I was just trying to articulate different types of experiences. Because I've had people come in and say, well, I don't know that I bargained, or I don't know that I've been angry, and maybe I'm not doing this correctly. And I mean, that's summed up for me. There was this wonderful person that I dealt with some years ago, beautiful faith-based lady, and she had lost her husband of 50 odd years. And so she came in and I was asking her, well, how are you doing? She said, well, she belonged to a small church that had been very supportive, very gathered around her, very loving. And she said, she really appreciated that, but many of them have given me books about grief. And then she pointed, she said, I have a small stack of them. And she, of course, was very compliant. And she said, and I've read them all. It was about 15 books on grief. I said, what do you think? She said, I'm completely confused. She said, one book will tell me to give my husband's belongings away right away. Another book will tell me keep them as long as I want to, and on and on and on. So you know what I did? I gave her a book to read.
Here's your 16th book.
Absolutely. But what I gave her was A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis,
Mm.
which was really his journal for the first year after he lost his wife. It's a beautiful book. There's no easy answers. And at the end of the book, it's not like after the year of grieving, it's not like, okay, I'm done, I'm fine. It's very clear he's going to grieve the loss of his wife, Joy, for the rest of his life. Okay? So I recommended that book to this lady. She loved it. She came back a week later and said, I loved that book. It gave me permission to just deal with this the way that I'm dealing with it. That's right.
Yeah.
So, there's no, we have to be aware of it. We have to be open to it. I've always said that grief is sneaky. I can be thinking I'm doing fine. I'll give you a brief example. I had an aunt when I was growing up that was an integral part of our family. She was a great student of the Civil War. And so maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was rewatching. I decided I wanted to rewatch Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. And I started watching that and I thought, oh man, Aunt Dorothy would have loved this. And I got emotional, okay? Because it put me in touch with that grief over the loss of someone whom I really loved. And so, people will complain about that. I thought I was doing fine, but then I heard this song and I started weeping. Well, that's the nature of grief. It can sneak up on you. And so the things about grief that I think are helpful to accept is, one, there's no correct way to do it. And two, it never really goes away. I mean, you lost your mom. I lost my mom 30 years ago. Okay. Mother's Day is still a tough day. Okay. It's still a tough day. Do I feel as deeply hurt as the day that I got the call that she died or the day of her funeral? No, no. But do I still grieve that loss? You bet. You bet I do. And I think that's good when people can just accept that there's no correct way and that it never really goes away completely. And the fact that I may get sad about the death of my mother 30 years ago doesn't mean I've not dealt with something. It just means that's the nature of grieving.
Yeah, and that you're human.
Yeah, and that we're human.
You're
and
a
that
human being who loves. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It's it's the grief is the price tag you pay for loving. I remember dealing with a different lady who had lost her husband, and she was just really, really in anguish about it. It had been a sudden death, and they were very close. And I said to her, well, suppose we had a time machine, okay? Suppose you could get in that time machine and go back to when you first met your husband, and instead you turned and you walked away. Would you do that? And she just laughed and said, I'd never do that, because I would have missed out on all those years we had together. And I said, yeah, and this is the price tag.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we have covered a lot of ground, Dr.
Yes, sir.
Patterson. What did we leave out? Is there anything else that you wanted to hit on?
Well, reference PTSD, there is a very, very good website. It's called ptsd.va.gov, G-O-V. And it's not just for combat veterans. It's for anybody that suffered trauma. And it's just got a wealth of good guidance, good information, techniques of relaxation training, and so on. The one thing we didn't get into, which I'll cover quickly here, is therapy. Okay. Does therapy help trauma? Absolutely. There's some good trauma therapies out there right now. And I think the only things to keep in mind, sometimes before people get into productive trauma therapy, they need to address a substance or alcohol issue, because that's how a lot of people cope with trauma sometimes. So that's not uncommon. But I think that if they're having trouble managing the anger, if they're having trouble with nightmares, they're having flashbacks, or they're having trouble with depression, then yes, it's a good thing to reach out and find a counselor, and to not be afraid to ask questions of a counselor, like, do you have good training and experience treating trauma? Okay, because therapists can say, yes, I treat trauma, and they may not have a whole lot of experience doing that. And people owe it to themselves to have somebody that knows what they're doing. And if they want to have a spiritual perspective incorporated, to not be afraid about asking about that. To me, I would never push any kind of beliefs on anybody, but I certainly felt it was appropriate to ask them, how are you doing spiritually with all this? And some people are drawing on their faith to get through it all. And so to have a counselor or a therapist who is sensitive to that issue can also be helpful. And finally, to not be afraid to ask if the therapist is going anywhere. Because I know a lot of people that go to places like the VA get frustrated because the counselor changes, especially when it comes to healing from trauma. That's a problem. So not, towards the end of my private practice, people would come in and they would see that I had a little bit of snow on the mountaintop there, and they would ask me, are you planning to retire anytime soon? I always thought that was a fair question, because they didn't want to start dealing with something and then have to start all over with somebody else. So that's also a fair question. And yes, I think that there are good therapies out there that can be helpful, and also to be wary of people who. There was one other therapist in town who was telling people he would cure their trauma in 12 sessions, and there's no therapy on earth that can do things that quickly. I wish there was. I'd go sign up for it.
Yeah.
But there isn't. So to just be aware of people who claim those kind of things. And then finally, here's my last piece of advice, and I'll let you go, okay?
You can keep going as long as you want. This is great. I could talk to you all day.
Has to do with the story. And I think this is ultimately, you had asked me previously about families and people, support people and so on. And yes, that's important. It helps for those people to educate themselves about the symptoms of trauma and so on. For instance, it's not uncommon for a trauma sufferer to go to a restaurant and need to sit with their back to a wall and being able to see the exit. Okay. That's okay. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with them doing that. And so it does help for families to understand a little bit about the trauma that their loved one is going through. And then finally, it's summed up for me with, I've often viewed most of my clients as teachers. And I had a wonderful, wonderful lesson years ago. This lady came in and she told me briefly what her issues were. And this was when I was a young therapist. She told me her issues briefly, and I immediately began to pontificate on why I thought she had this problem, what she needed to do about it, etc. And she listened politely for about 10 minutes. And then finally, she just put her hand up like this and said, "Would you please be quiet and just listen to me for a little while?" Okay. And I, of course, said, "You got it." And what happened then was wonderful. She sat there and talked for about 20 minutes. She worked her way through the issue herself. Okay. She talked her way through it. She reached an end point. I said something really profound like, "Well, sometimes you got to do what you got to do." And she stood up and thanked me and gave me a hug. And then I got some feedback a few months later that she found this very helpful. She resolved her situation. But I was the one that was left with the gift because of her telling me, "Would you please be quiet and just listen to me?" And that's something that we can offer to anybody that's been traumatized. If we can, it means, yes, you listen to some hard stuff to hear. But a lot of these folks of trauma of any sort, all that they really need is somebody to listen to them, who's willing to just sit down and say, "Tell me how you're doing. Tell me what you went through." And is really willing to listen without judgment, without, "Well, if you just pray hard enough, you'll be fine," or, "Well, if you just do this, you'll be fine." No, to just listen. And that, to me, is the cornerstone of really any kind of wounded healer work, is keep my mouth shut and just listen.
Well, this has been such a joy, Dr. Patterson. Thank you for
thanks for
coming on
having
Off
me.
the Page, and I encourage our listeners to check out your work in St. Anthony Messenger and then online as well. They can just search your name, and you have some really wonderful stuff. And I hope and pray this conversation is healing for
Me
our
too.
listeners. So
I
thank you.
hope so very much. Very much. Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Once again, that was Dr. Richard Patterson. I've linked to Dr. Patterson's articles in St. Anthony Messenger and some of his other work in the show notes of this episode, as well as to the helpful trauma resources Dr. Patterson mentioned at the end of our conversation. Thank you for tuning in, and thanks as always for your support. This is Stephen Copeland signing off. Peace and all good.
I will lead you into the desert with me and tenderly speak to your